Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to one more week of the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. And this week, joining us from Jacksonville in Florida is Steve Silbert. Hi, Steve. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Vasco. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Steve is an Agile coach living in Jacksonville, Florida. He's a co-curator of SketchnoteArmy, sits on the board of directors for a spiritual innovation incubator. That's an interesting term. And designs Agile games in his spare time. So Steve, that was a short intro. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and how did you end up becoming a Scrum Master?
I kind of self-identify as that guy who's standing in the cheap toy aisle of the local drugstore, looking at him going, I can hack that. I've been around Agile since about 2004. I was working with Lisa Atkins when she was a PMO director. And then I left and went to go over to Circuit City. And about 3 months later, I brought her over to be my new manager. And she had just gotten the Agile bug. So she approached me one day and says, hey, I'd like to send you this thing called Scrum Master certification. And I, like everybody else, said, that's the stupidest name for a title I've ever heard. What's it all about? So I went and I actually went with my wife who said, I'd like to try that. I'd like to do that as well. So we kind of had a husband-wife 2-day certification with Ken Schwaber, which was interesting. And on the way back, we realized that a lot of the things that we were doing in our lives that are causing aggravation in marriages, like the list on the refrigerator of stuff that gets started but never completed, if we just did a few things, we could connect it all together and really start our Agile journey with Agile at home. So we acknowledge that our dinners, daily dinners, are daily stand-ups, because what do you ask? How was your day? What are you doing tomorrow? And do you have any impediments? And we'd already established the practice of doing a weekly where the two of us just go away from all the kids and talk about what we've done and plan out the week forward. So we were all kind of a 1 week sprint, and it worked. It worked. We got rid of the thing on the refrigerator, started getting things done, focusing on fewer projects around the house. And from there, we basically naturally took that into our workplaces. So it was kind of reverse for us.
Absolutely, and the fact that you already worked with Lisa Atkins way back, she was before she was actually an Agile guru like she is now.
Yeah. I mean, so Lisa and I have known each other for 20 years. It feels like it's almost 20 years. So that was a good experience.
Yeah, and of course, her book is one of the customary books mentioned here on the podcast on the Tuesday episode. So I'll surely drop her a note to say that she was mentioned on this episode in a different context than as an author of one of the most popular Agile books. So, all right, but
well, if you ask me about favorite books, I'd probably put that in there too. So you might get a second.
All right, there you go. So, Steve, on Mondays, this is the Monday episode, of course, we talk about failures. And that's important because we learn a lot from it, as you were just sharing also in your personal life. So share with us a story of a failure you had as a Scrum Master, something you tried, but, at that time, it just wasn't the right thing. And of course, we'll go through the learnings of that. But first, tell us that story of that failure and what led to it.
So many failures, so little time to talk. There's a couple of them that stick out. One of which I was working with a group of teams that were basically building out like a risk score like FICO. It was a bank. And we were trying to replicate that without having to pay FICO a lot of money. So we organized the teams with the product owners were data scientists, because the teams were doing like operation. The stories were all ones. It was change this to, X plus Y plus Z. It was that simple. And we tested out, look at the times, the consumption, all that. And what we realized was that the stories were so small, but there were so many of them that we actually wanted to go to 1 week sprints. and it seemed to work okay. The challenge was the first time that we failed was because I think that I failed to recognize that a 1 week sprint is astronomically different than a 2 week sprint. If nothing else, in terms of the balance of planning versus doing time, because you end up planning much more of a percentage of the sprint than you would with the 2 week or longer sprints. I didn't think about it that way. I was just scaling it, going, have the time to plan, and it caused all sorts of bottlenecks. So fortunately, that failure didn't last long because these 2 or 3 teams were great groups of people to work with. We all had a great, honest relationship, and we figured out that we weren't planning enough for the 1 week sprint. And once we went to basically 20% of the sprint was spent in planning and refinement and really working with the product owner to make sure we understood the vision. Once we really upped that percentage, we were off to the races. So that was one of those things where, hey, you know what? You learn by talking as a group and being honest.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it's quite interesting that you mentioned that a 1 week sprint is astronomically different than a 2 week sprint. So one of the things I realized is that once you go into a 1 week sprint, there's a lot of things that would require a daily stand-up that cannot wait for a daily stand-up in a 1 week sprint. Like, for example, let's say that, John is blocked or whatever. Like if you wait one day, you've just lost 20% of the sprint waiting one day. So so from my perspective, when I work with teams, I'm thinking in a 1 day sprint, you really want the stand-ups to be almost instantaneous, right? Like establishing a Slack channel where you always, flag things or whatever. Like what were the biggest differences besides, adjusting the planning time? What were the biggest differences that you saw between that 2 week and the 1 week sprint?
Yeah, to your point about the communication style, we aside from a few ceremonies, we essentially got rid of stand-ups because we were always standing up. So we went from synchronous to asynchronous communication. Slack was what we used. So we had a shared Slack space that everybody always had up on screen somewhere. So if someone needed something, they said it, they got the response. 2 of the 3 teams were co-located. The third one was scattered across North America. So that asynchronous communication worked for all teams. So I think that was the biggest thing. That and learning how to communicate asynchronously, it's different. Even how you call out impediments, when you call them out, how do you do that in a Slack channel when it's easy just to look up and say, hey, product owner, I've got an impediment. What if they're not there? What if you need them and they're in a different state? How do you do that? Is there someone else that can help you? So there's a tendency to rely more on the support structure. And I don't like the word escalation, but I would say to get a quick group knowledge that there's a problem and everybody swarm the problem. So which takes a completely different dynamic for the team in terms of trusting each other, shared language, shared vision of what we're trying to accomplish, shared commitments, and basically we all finish or we don't finish at all. So there's a lot of those things that need to be worked through.
So if there's a Scrum Master now listening to us, let's call him Luke, our faithful Scrum Master friend out there. If Luke is considering helping the team move into a 1 week sprint, what would be the 1, 2, or 3 things you would tell Luke, hey, consider this before you do that change?
Yeah. First, I would dissuade you from doing it if I could possibly do it. The biggest challenge is keeping the team from getting burned out. As the agilist in the group, being that steward of team culture and people health as one of our roles, learning how to keep them at a sustainable pace and when to take a break and how we can do that individually, as self-care so that we don't burn out, because it is a rapid, fast pace. I think so. I probably would tell Luke, take a look at the basic Scrum structure if you're going to do Scrum, or Kanban if you're planning on that. Really understand not how to do it, but why you're doing things. Shuhari. Get yourself into that ha space and get to the point where you go, I know why we do stand-ups. we may need to do it a different way, and that's okay. So understand the whys of the framework that you're going to use, and don't hold any sacred cows. Don't make anything carved in stone. Understand it's got to be flexible, and you have to be one step ahead of the team in terms of the size and the depth of your own personal toolkit.
That's perfect. Great story. Thank you for that, Steve.
Sure.
Monday is about what we learn from our obstacles and our failures. But tomorrow is Team Tuesday here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. We explore teams and their journeys, the habits they develop that threaten their performance, how each of our guests helped their teams evolve, and the one key lesson they learned from that experience. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.